Mr. Prime Minister, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Kultaranta. The presidential couples will be joining us in just a few seconds, and then the Kultaranta talks will begin. We will first hear a few words by our President, President Niinistö, followed with a speech from our keynote speaker, Mr. Frank-Walter Steinmeier, President of the Federal Republic of Germany. After that, the two presidents will have a discussion on the future of Europe. Then it will be your turn to comment and to ask questions. But now, the presidential couples, so please rise. And President Niinistö, if I can ask you to come directly to the stage. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, you're most welcome to Kultaranta. Like you see, actually it's sunny Kultaranta. Once again, I want to welcome specifically our guests, President Frank-Walter Steinmeier and Madam Elke Budenbender. It's great to have you here today. This is the seventh Kultaranta discussion we are now starting, and today we are going to talk about common Europe and European Union. Tomorrow we will continue with Europe, but also more maybe Finland-specific issues like state of democracy, very important, state of security and state of welfare. Finland is now, in 2 weeks' time, starting its presidency, her presidency in European Union. The time is a very special one, very demanding, very challenging. If we look globally, so the vision for the future is not very clear. And we are now used to surprises. Actually, it would be a surprise if we didn't get any surprises in nearby future. Those are very, very difficult to predict. That's a demanding task for European Union and for the presidency. Extra is that after European Parliament elections, surely the leadership in different institutions is open, and I just hope that the process would be fast, because an institution which concentrates to nominate its leadership for a long period, is not very reliable. So, as soon as possible, we should be prepared to that. But the most central question is what I would like to pose to all leaders of EU countries. And that is quite simply asking whether we have still something in common. I'm sure that there would be a lot of answers. Yes, we have. We just should remind ourselves once again why we are together. Because if we find common nominators, it's a lot easier to talk about those issues we don't agree totally. In this respect, I see that we are following, Frank-Walter, your initiative made a month ago, approximately, when Frank-Walter collected all the European presidents, 21 together, to sign a statement emphasizing the importance of keeping Europe in good speed. I remember after our first discussion here, I read one journalist writing that, yes, the guests were very interesting. So actually, I drew two conclusions from that. Keep your own speeches short and invite even more interesting guests. We all know Frank-Walter Steinmeier. He has a long career in foreign policy, in administration, in advisor, and finally, Minister of Foreign Affairs. We also know that you're well known worldwide. You have a very wide network. But maybe all of us are not aware that in Germany there was a soccer team called Brakelsjälk. And in midfield we found a very reliable defensive player called Mr. Steinmeier. They say that he's a kind of a person whom you can put to any position on field, because you could always rely that he's solid and stable, whatever he does. And I have to say that the time I have been acquainted to Frank-Walter, I can sign this statement. So, please, the floor is yours, and do remember that a midfielder can also make goals.
Mr. President, dear Sauli, dear Jenny, Mr. Prime Minister, dear Antti, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, so many well-known faces here around. Thank you for that. Thank you for your time. And let me start by saying it is wonderful to be back in Finland. My wife and I have great memories of our state visit to Finland last September that took us to Helsinki and to Oulu. But we were not able to see all the beauty of your country. Thank you, Sauli, for bringing us to Kultaranta, this magnificent place, and on one, we experienced that of the longest nights of the year. Much has changed since we sat down for our consultations last September. First of all, Finland is world champion in ice hockey. Hyvä Suomi. Then Finland has a new government. And Finland will take over and Finland will take over, Sauli, you were mentioning that, Finland will take over the EU presidency in 2 weeks' time. And in the meantime, we Europeans went to the polls on May 26 to elect a new European Parliament. So this is indeed a good moment to reflect on Europe's challenges and the major tasks facing our continent and our union. Dear friends, Finland is certainly an inspiring place to reflect on all these issues. The reasons are manifold. There is also a personal one. You know, I was round about 18, 19 years old and doing my military service in Goslar, close to the inner German border, the most heavily militarized area in the world at the time. And I was serving there in a few kilometers distance to the Iron Curtain when ladies and gentlemen, when the final act of the Conference of Security and Cooperation in Europe was signed in Helsinki. And I remember the TV images. Gerald Ford and Leonid Brezhnev, Henry Kissinger and Andrei Gromyko, Helmut Schmidt and Erich Honecker. It was, as we know, with the benefit of hindsight, one of those pivotal moments in history that leave their mark on an entire generation. The wisdom and ingenuity of a great Finn, Urho Kekkonen, was indispensable to make it happen. He pursued the interests of his own country, Finland, but he did so with a broad vision and a deep understanding that fostered peace and security on the entire European continent and beyond. When we celebrate the Helsinki Final Act as a milestone in history, we sometimes forget how controversial it was at the time. To many, it seemed as if the Soviet Union had achieved its most important goal, the ratification of its dominance and occupation of Eastern and Central Europe. It took time for the seeds planted in the so-called third basket on human rights and fundamental freedoms to come to fruition and to help bring about the fall of the Iron Curtain and the advent of democracy and the rule of law all over Europe. This is worth remembering because the statesmen of those days were anything but certain about the effects of the final act. Yes, it's provided a glimpse of a better future. But confrontation and systemic rivalry continued for many, many years. It was only after the miraculously peaceful revolutions of 1989 that it all suddenly seemed so logical and then to many even inevitable. The Charter of Paris of 1990 enshrined this optimism of a Europe whole and free, a Europe based on peaceful cooperation, the rule of law, and ever deeper integration. And today, the optimism of 1989 and of the early internet pioneers has given way to a pervasive pessimism. Strongmen seem to have taken over and to be dominating the agenda. Democracy, human rights, and international cooperation seem to be in retreat. Yes, it is true that our societies and political systems are under pressure. They are undergoing rapid and fundamental changes. The causes are manifold, some of them local, others are rooted in broader global trends and technological advances. But just as I was skeptical of the optimism of the so-called unipolar moment, I do not share today's pessimism. Linear thinking is a very human temptation, but is a fallacy or illusion when it comes to history and politics. The future, that is what I want to say, the future is ours to shape. And just as previous generations of politicians, from Willy Brandt to Urho Kekkonen, worked hard to ensure freedom, prosperity, and peace under adverse circumstances, now we have to do our best, not by indulging in simple and often misleading analogies with the past, but rather by putting our minds to work on the new and very complex situation in which Europe finds itself today. That was the spirit in which we tried to make use of our last German OSCE chairmanship, and Finland was acting in its presidency in the Arctic Council. And that is exactly the spirit we need even more today. Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, I will not attempt to analyze in any detail the many changes that require us to rethink our policy approaches. I will only try to outline two of the major challenges. Firstly, consolidating our union. It does not require rocket science to conclude that in times of increasing uncertainty and rising new powers, violent crises and new confrontation, that in these times we Europeans are well advised to strengthen our home base. We have to improve our internal cohesion and to expand our capacity and instruments for independent and really strategic action. After years of attending the Foreign Affairs Council and visiting member states as foreign minister and now as president, I'm under no illusion about the difficulties. There are plenty of policy differences among the member states. There are also deeper divides that are even more difficult to bridge now. And there is still the nightmare of Brexit, and with it, the loss of a capable, important member state, particularly as regards foreign and security policy issues. And yet I remain reasonably optimistic. In a joint call, Sauli was mentioning it, that President Niinistö and I launched with 19 other heads of state, including Hungary, including Poland, including Romania, before the European elections. Let me just quote, "We all agree that European integration and unity is essential, and that we want to continue Europe as a union. Only a strong community," was said in this statement, "will be able to face up to the global challenges of our time," unquote. And this is exactly the basis. And I believe against the skeptics and the pessimism of the day, this basis is still intact. The rationale for Europe's union is as strong as ever. Many pressing decisions need to be made now on the new leadership of the institutions and the new team in Brussels. Then on the major policy issues confronting us, namely climate change, migration, and digital transformation. I'm glad that in 2 weeks' time, Prime Minister Antti Rinne and his team will play a major role during the Finnish presidency in the efforts to translate our citizens' vote into a fresh and courageous start for the European project and its institutions. The second challenge is, in my view, even more demanding on a conceptual level. The world's political and economic center of gravity is moving away from Europe. The pillars of the world order are being challenged by new rivalries. Europe has to reassess some of its own fundamental assumptions and to rethink its relations with the world's major powers. Ladies and gentlemen, to start with some sentences with the United States. It tends to be forgotten that Atlanticism was hardly a characteristic throughout the 19th century, when the US still resented feudal Europe. Today's strong transatlantic ties have been shaped by 2 world wars. Atlanticism was an American creation that saved and protected Europe in unprecedented circumstances. In the currently unfolding global competition, with the US and China as main drivers, Much will depend now on Europe to keep Atlanticism alive in the vital interest of both Europe and the United States, no matter how alienating developments in parts of the US may appear. Atlanticism will require political wisdom on both sides, irrespective of moments of discord and even rivalry. This poses an immense challenge to prudent and responsible political leadership. And yet, at the same time, Europe can only play this part credibly by becoming a more active player itself. We'll say we have to strengthen our own European capabilities. And we also have to develop a more active common foreign policy approach that goes beyond sanctions and blockades. An approach that invests more in developing partnerships with regions critical to our interests, such as states in Africa or Central Asia, where I've been traveling a lot in the past and I'm able to witness that, for instance, Uzbekistan is currently a particular promising example that changes are possible. Then, ladies and gentlemen, Russia. Then Russia, our hopes, including my own, of a wide-ranging, increasingly integrated partnership with Russia have not materialized. Analysts and historians have ample material to study the reasons for that. We live in a period of tensions, sanctions, and mutual recriminations. Although the causes of specific conflicts are by no means equivalent, there is deep disappointment on both sides. Some fear a return to what they call business as usual. I do not share this concern. I do not believe there will be anything like business as usual with Russia going forward. It's something else. Moscow is looking for a new conceptual frame for its relationship with Europe. Many signs point to a more inward-looking Russia, a Russia that looks less to Europe as a reference and source of modernization and for its own future. More than at almost any point over the last 3 centuries, a more sober relationship, one less fraught with expectations of transformation, maybe not the bad alternative. But a colder, more distant relationship is not without risks either. And the continuing conflict in eastern Ukraine remains a heavy burden, as does the annexation of Crimea. What should Europe's own new conceptual approach to Russia be? We should not condone Russia's shrinking space for free expression of its civil society. That's first. The recent arrest and release of journalist Ivan Golunov again demonstrated the need for and the value of close attention and practical solidarity. But we should be more aware of the limits of our own capabilities to change Russia in the interest of a more functional relationship. I realize that this will be a controversial process of rethinking, but we Europeans will not be able to escape it, and I know that Finland is at the forefront of this debate also today. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, China. I know that Finnair is one of the most active European airlines in the China business. And it takes a globe, not a map, to understand why. Helsinki is much closer to Beijing than Berlin. And yet, we all have to acknowledge that China is becoming both closer to us and more distant from us at the same time. China is a partner in many areas, and we should continue to invest in this functional part of our relationship, means in business, cultural, and political cooperation. China is Germany's largest trading partner today. But China is also increasingly a competitor, and in some areas, as the European Commission recently put it, a systemic rival. How do we want this relationship to develop within the dynamics between the US, China, Russia, and Europe? Are we able to maintain our cohesion at the European Union in the face of a developing global high-tech confrontation? Or are we able to keep the cohesion against the tempting infrastructure investments promises China offers a 70+1 format dominated by its own interests? Are we keeping our cohesion under these circumstances? The way we think about future relations with the great powers will necessarily also shape the international dynamics of our efforts to strengthen the European Union. It will inform our initiatives to prevent major conflicts and to promote a rules-based international order. It will shape our policies across issues such as climate change and across regions like the High North and the Arctic, where Finland and others face a rapidly changing environment. But it will also play a role in our difficult and crisis-ridden southern neighborhood in the Middle East and in the Maghreb region. Europe's new security environment is not only a consequence of disruptive decisions in the current US administration. It follows, that is my analysis, it follows from the tectonic shifts in economic, political, and military power in today's world. So therefore, we have a lot of challenges ahead of us, and I hope that we all know that putting our own European house in order is the best way to keep our credibility and to show others around the world that there is still a reason that we should be confident in the power of our own example. Ladies and gentlemen, let me stop here and turn this into what the title of the event promises, the Kulturanta Talks. So, kiitos, thank you, und vielen Dank. Thank you.
Okay. One glass and one pair of glasses.
Okay, that's good too.
Thanks.
So, Frank Walter,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you for your excellent opinions. I'm sure the journalist I referred to is even more sure about how interesting guests we have here. And you were sophisticated while congratulating us on Ice Hockey World Championship. He never mentioned that we lost Germany. But nevertheless, well, we are facing, I think, a totally new world. And especially for Europeans, it's a huge challenge. It's a lesson also I mean, there were times 20, 30 years ago when we somehow ended up to think that we are kind of best in the world. And that has changed very rapidly. But I go back to history, to 70s. You referred to Helsinki meeting and Helsinki Final Act. If we compare the situation at the moment to situation before Helsinki Final Act, there are some similarities, but there are even more worrying things. And now I mean the INF and arms control. During the Cold War, I would say that 60s meant a Cold War without any limitations. But then the big ones, USA, Russia, Soviet Union, started to discuss about our arms limitation. And years from 70 to 90 actually were somehow limited Cold War. Then in 90s, the Cold War ended. We got back to limited Cold War maybe 10 years ago. But now if we lose all the limitations, like INF, we are facing back to 60s, a Cold War or something alike without no agreements. How do you see the situation if you compare these 70s?
I think the circumstances are completely different. That was the reason why I was saying, we should not look for solutions for the future in the past, because we need a different approach and a different style of solutions. So therefore, although, I would say under these circumstances in the 70s, the politicians, the responsible politicians which were mentioned, were acting in a risky but responsible way, and at the end, history gave them right. We do not know in this phase of history in which we are, where we really standing. Talking to the youngsters in German politics, many of them have the impression we are at the end of a certain period, which is dominated by the erosion of the international order. I think it's fair to say and realistic enough that we are perhaps in the middle of the process, not close to an end. And the dynamics, are more and more driving into more erosion of the international order. That's the reason why it's so important in these days, first of all, to collect those who are fighting for the international order, and these are the states and economies which are depending from a rules-based international order. First of all, in economics, because export-orientated countries like Germany, like Finland, need, a credible international order. But secondly, because I believe at the end, in a few years, also those who are not recognizing in these days the importance of accepted rules will see and will be convinced in a few years that there is a need of some rules, or what we call an international order. So therefore we are, for the time being, regarding the international order in a sort of surviving modus, and therefore we have to collect those who are standing for that. And Antti, don't be afraid, but this is one of the main tasks for the European Union. Europe must be, the example in the changing world, which is fighting for this international order and keeping the respect to the United Nations and other international cooperation. So therefore, I think when I'm reading the newspapers, the role of Europe is for the time completely underestimated, because we are producing every day bad news, mainly about the Brexit and the inability not to solve this one and only problem. And the impression, and that was something I was very carefully listening to the discussion in the German population. The Brexit is not only a damage to the British economy or to the British political establishment. I think the damage which is already done to Europe is already there, because the people are not believing that if we are not able to administrate a political decision which has been taken, the Brexit, if we are not able to administrate that we are not in a situation that Europe is really successfully dealing with some other priorities, mainly, economic stability, social equality, and the fight against climate change. So it's not only about Brexit, it's about the credibility of the European institutions.
Okay. As a matter of fact, you said that Antti should start collecting countries which have the same values, at least respect for rules-based order. On the other hand, many of those countries, basically, which are supporting rules-based system, are under influence, economic influence by China, for example. What is a temptation to, let's say yes to these influences, positive ones, or just to join the European Union supporting rules-based order? That is not an easy case.
No,
it looks a bit like country by country are, being seduced to, different kind of mostly economic elements, to forget actually the rules-based order. I fully agree with you about Brexit. The huge damage actually is already done. I have not understood for a longer period what are they voting now. And I guess nobody actually has followed so clearly. And in each voting there is some kind of backdoor. If you vote this way, you might actually support something you're not supporting. When people hear this kind of, tactics, it's very difficult to say that, we rely on the system. So I think that European Union has had quite a clear position all the time, but it gets a bit mixed up because the news come from London, and maybe we are swimming with with that kind of news, even though European Union hasn't caused them. We are in a habit of repeating bad news. You talked about optimism. Would you tell us how do you see optimistically Europe after, let's say, 5-10 years' time?
Yeah, it's optimism which is, first of all, our duty as president. Secondly, based on experiences, and thirdly, on hope. The hope is that Europeans are ready to learn the lessons from the Brexit, and that is something what I experienced during the last weeks when we were talking with different other heads of states, especially from Eastern Europe, about our common statement for Europe, because many of those where I expected skepticism or even rejecting of any ideas to say something positive and publicly about Europe, even those heads of state, I think, were aware about the risks in which we are living in Europe. So therefore, I think there is a rising awareness that if not the Europeans, who else should fight for the European cohesion? I don't know if I'm right, but I'm not able to discover some interest in Beijing or in Moscow or in Washington to keep the European Union united. So therefore, if there is no interest in the capitals of the big powers, I think the lessons we have to learn that we ourselves here in Europe have to be convincing enough that we see the European Union as our common future. And because I was talking about some of the challenges from the 21st century, when you are talking to our colleagues, apart from a daily conflict in the European Union, everybody is admitting that the fight against climate change, for instance, can only be done by the European Union and international efforts, because the pollution is not ending at the border of a national state. So therefore, back to the basics and away from the daily conflicts. That might be a lesson we have to learn to rediscover the value of the European Union, and not to forget the history where we are coming from after 2 world wars.
So a best optimistic view would be that little by little, more and more leaders start to, in a way, get back to roots and understand that we do have a lot of common. So the question, what we have in common, might be very relevant. And hopefully you get a lot of answers to that. But
I think your advice is following my experience when we were asking our colleagues to sign this document. I think your approach is the right one, because we never did in the past a common rethinking about the common values and the common interests and the common objectives of the European Union. We were basically talking and completely focused on the daily conflicts. And so therefore, to turn around the daily communication might have some impact.
Yeah. We don't have so very many old-timers here, but I remember those days when Finland joined the Union in 90s, and somehow you really felt it when you had your first EU meeting, that, we are here together and we have a target where we are aiming at. We have differences in opinions, but nevertheless, the big picture was totally similar. One interesting element is transatlantic relation. You referred to that.
Interesting is a good word.
Yeah, very interesting, actually. I met Mr. Saunders. He's EU ambassador for USA, and we had a discussion where I said that do you understand in USA that it's not a one-way route, that USA is important to Europe, but Europe is also important to United States. I think that we have a task here to make ourselves important, to collect information, to tell clearly that you need us also. It's not only one-sided relation. And I met leaders of European business organizations last week. It appeared that they have invested, European companies, huge amounts to US industries. They serve give a lot of jobs to Americans. We should raise our voice in these kind of issues. And on the other hand, actually the rules-based order we are now having, it's originally based quite a lot to what USA wanted it to be. So, well, maybe we should remind them that keep on your old wishes, we are supporting them.
And there's one example from the last 2 years, because traveling around in Europe, so many colleagues are complaining about the dominance of some global players in the IT economy. And, this was another example that if not Europe acts in a common approach to create a level playing field, then, every national state and every national approach is completely without any possibility to defend their national economy. Yeah. So therefore, I think when I was talking about the shift of gravities in politics, that is in the same way in some branches of the economy, similar development. And so therefore, we need strong European institutions for keeping the level playing field and for keeping, the chances and the perspectives for our national business. So therefore, that is sometimes not enough understood even in our national business organizations. And I myself, had a lot of meetings in the weeks and months before the European elections to keep them aware that Europe is not something in which they are allowed to stand aside, but that it's in their interest and that they have to show up in this not easy campaigning in front of before the European elections.
We have been talking here in Finland a lot of security and defense in European Union. I have posed sometimes questions to European leaders that what would European Union do if one of its member states, which is not belonging to NATO, would be invaded, and what shall Union do? Would it have a new meeting in Brussels stating that, well, we have to sign a new agreement on this union because one of the original signers is missing now? Yeah. That brings me to think about unions in history. Usually when unions have been formed, they are first of all, their task has been to secure the life of their members, of their citizens. That is security and, if needed, also defense. Well, I get the answer sometimes to my question I referred to, and that answer is that, well, NATO is taking care of that. Well, that leads me to think that what kind of a union is a union which actually is based on outside help, which is not taking care of what union usually have done, unions. Somehow, sometimes easily gets a feeling that there's a constructural lack in the union. But to mild up this a bit, we are very satisfied finding out that during the past 3-4 years, the discussion on security defense issues in union has started. Late, but nevertheless good.
Yeah, I wouldn't name it a lack. At the end, is it a lack? It is a lack, but it's first of all a consequence of history. You're in a different position in Finland, but when I'm talking about the German position, we are used to divide the hard security from the soft security, and we were shifting the responsibility for hard security to NATO. And inside the European Union, we were more or less, but dominantly talking about soft security issues. And that might be the reason why we were not enough talking about the hard security issues in the European Union. If we would have done that, I don't know if we in the European Union would be now in a very better shape, because there is a lack of readiness to come to common European positions on foreign and security issues. I remember a sentence in one of the articles in the last weeks, in which was said or was given the advice, Europe should speak less and mean more. And the author wanted to give the advice that there are many statements from the European Union in foreign policy issues, but perhaps a lack of deeds. And therefore I was mentioning the regions in which we as the European Union have our critical interests. And we were talking this morning about Northern Africa, the present crisis in Sudan. There are some people here with us who have a deep knowledge about the region there. We know if Sudan is collapsing, what that means for new flows of refugees. I'm taking this only as an example that there are regions around of Europe in which we should be more visible, and regions in which we should take action. And the same is Central Asia. Central Asia, Central Asia is a region with states in a completely different period of their historical development. For the first time, I saw after the death of Karimov, who was ruling the country in an autocratic manner for, I think, 27 years, there is a slight change in the leadership of Uzbekistan, and for the first time, I think Europe should take serious that there is somebody, that there is a new leadership who is looking for a new course of the country. I'm taking this as an example for saying, what is Europe doing in this situation? I think it's not enough to complain about the Chinese dynamic foreign policy by, spreading out their strategy of the Silk Road and giving offers to the Central Asian region. They will be successful with this strategy if Europe is not present in the region. But we know that Central Asia, and especially a country like Uzbekistan, is afraid to be only in the hands of China or under the dominance of Russia. They are looking for a little bit more balance, but this can only be created if the European Union is playing a more active role in those regions in our close neighborhood. So I'm using these examples for to say that we should not limit our foreign policy capabilities in Europe. We should not limit that for statements and votings. What I want to see is a much more active and common European foreign policy, and more awareness that security is a part of that.
Yeah.
Mr. President, I would never interrupt you, but do you think that now is a good time for questions? Yes, okay.
Okay.
All right. So there are microphones on each table, and we just heard President Steinmeier say, speak less and mean more. I think that's a good rule also when you comment here. So I do see hands. Erkki Tuomioja, please.
Thank you. I wish I could share President Steinmeier's optimism, but then as a confirmed pessimist,
You have
I have
to,
more
Erkki.
chances of being pleasantly surprised. But I think I agree that most leaders, if not all in Europe, see this situation in very much the same colors. But do we know what to do? How do we make a reality of our vision for Europe? And I'm concerned about democracy. Sometimes one can be very frustrated with democracy given some of the results we see everywhere in the world. But nevertheless, there's no alternative. But we must remember that the populist and nationalist, of whom many of us seem to be afraid of, and who stop our freedom of action. But we must remember that the majority of Europeans do not share these views. So how do we mobilize democracy to make a strong European presence in the world in the spirit that both of you have exposed?
Yeah, Erkki, don't be too pessimistic, because remember the situation in the polls before the European elections. I know exactly, the polls in Germany, and we were closely following the polls in our neighbor states, in France, for instance. There was half a year before the elections a real risk that the populist nationalists would play a dominating role in the European Parliament, and that an anti-European approach might be creating a blockade in the European Parliament. I think, thanks to the engagement of many in the campaign before the elections to the European Parliament, we succeeded in increasing the awareness that this is not something, that the elections are not something which we should be able to neglect. I think the importance of the European elections were well known in most of the member states, and yes, the number of parliamentarians was a Eurosceptical or democracy-skeptical approach is bigger than in the last European Parliament, but not as big as we expected 6 months before the election. So therefore, this might be not a sufficient convincing example, but it shows that engagement is not without sense and not without consequence. So therefore, the advice to ourselves is not only to complain about the situation, but to engage and on all political levels. And I'm still quite sure that there is the majority in most of the European member states who are not willing to accept that after a process of 6 decades of integration, we are now entering in a process of disintegration. I do not believe that.
We have to keep in mind also that huge majority in all member countries, huge majority of people actually supported, according to polls. This discussion somehow brings to my mind the history of Suomen maaseudun puolue and perussuomalaiset, a couple of Finnish populistic parties. After getting some responsibilities entering government, well, both of them were in a way tamed. But what we saw during the spring elections, we heard parties like the new True Finns in Finland saying that they are not demanding anymore, they are not totally against EU anymore. They want to change it. But earlier on, maybe Jussi Halla-aho here remembers when he had said that we should get rid of the whole union. So there's kind of development, but in the same time we have to remember that if we tame one party, there will be another very easily. That's also a Finnish experience. But to your question, how Europe could do better, I think it's an easy answer to blame the populistic and nationalistic parties, because actually Europe has lost its position year after year for a longer period. And that has not, at least not only, been due to populistic parties. So we should really do better.
Moscow correspondent Anna-Leena Laureen.
Thank you. I have one question and one comment to Mr. Steinmeier. My question is, when you said that Russia, we should be conscious of our limited capacities to change Russia, what did you mean concretely? And a little comment on what you said about Russia trying to orientate itself towards China and other big countries. Russia loves to repeat this time and time again, that we don't need Europe. The other countries, Brazil, China, we want a multipolar world. But the only part of the world that they are consistently comparing themselves to, and which is their only real reference, is Europe. And it's always been like this.
Yeah. I have some doubts that this is still the case, because our alternatives in which we were thinking in the past is Russia moving towards Europe or to the east, to China. And I think this is, in the meantime, it's, from my point of view, the wrong alternative, because there are so many contradictions in the strategic approach between China and Russia, so that I don't believe that finally Russia will be close to China. But the direction of their move is from my point of view, more inwards. Neither orientation along the European values, nor closer to China. It's, inward-looking Russia with which we have to deal in the next future. And so therefore, what I was saying in my remarks in the beginning was, we have to do what is our obligation. And our obligation is, when I'm saying to keep the international order, to say clear and condemn how we see the annexation of Crimea and the role of Russia in the eastern Ukraine. The question is, and that is not a very new one, debated in many European Foreign Ministers' Council and between European foreign ministers in the last years. What is the value of dialogue? Is the value of dialogue a sort of award, or is it something what we need in every phase of diplomacy, and especially with the difficult players in the international world? I would say, an European Union which is limiting itself to statements and to sanctions is not is not, really raising the potential of a European foreign policy approach. So therefore, when I was saying in my initial remarks that we were perhaps witnessing during the last decades that we have limited capacities to change Russia completely, we should perhaps more evaluate and explore what is on a functional level possible under these conditions in which we are living in a sort of confrontation as long as the Ukrainian conflict is not yet solved. So therefore, the complicated debate we have in the European Union, if to keep the dialogue or to shut all the communication lines, I think is not really a very enlightened approach, because the dialogue is not only in the interest of Russia, that is what I'm usually saying, also in our interest, and especially with those partners which are as complicated as Russia is.
Prime Minister Antti Rinne.
Thank you. Thank you very much about your interesting discussion. And I will say I agree most of your points about these reasons why we are in this kind of situation here in Europe now. But I will ask you both, is there common reasons for this situation? I mean globally or European level, or is this situation based by situation which is inside the countries? I mean that the globalization has improved the people's employment situation in very many countries, and unemployment is one of the biggest factors which have improved the situation. But I will ask, is that a global phenomenon, European phenomenon, or national phenomenon which improves this situation?
It's an all-over phenomenon, surely. Maybe it has happened so that people combine this kind of, unpleasant experiences they've got from the globalization more to EU than, it sounds maybe rational in their minds, but then EU is suffering from something which EU is not to blame. Same fits surely with the on national level. So I guess you are after some kind of common disappointment or dissatisfaction with the situation globalization has brought. And that's totally another issue than what kind of EU we have. But unfortunately, people do connect these together. So maybe it would be wise to emphasize more about what globalization means, what it brings with it. It has brought a lot of good things too, and what negative things it might also bring. So to get these kind of institutions like EU or Mr. Rinte's government out of the criticism, to make the problem visible and show where it is.
Yeah, unfortunately, nobody is asking us if we are wanting the globalization or not. It's happening. And beyond the positive consequences, there are negative consequences. That is obvious, The polarization, especially in the liberal democracies, is visible and partly driven by the negative social consequences of globalization. And it's similar to what we will experience in the next future, that is digitalization. Nobody is asking us if we want digitalization, it's happening. We are perhaps able to influence the dynamics, but it will happen. So therefore, you know, the advice I'm giving in Germany is not only complaining about the consequences, but self-confident, looking for the potential we have in national politics or in combination with others in European politics to agree on conditions under which globalization or in the next period digitalization is happening. And again, when we are talking about the future digital world, you know, again, only Europe, or we, via Europe, are able to influence the dynamics. Without Europe, we are not in a very convincing and not in a very strong situation. So therefore, yes, we have the negative impacts from both developments, globalization and digitalization, but we need a common European approach to, you know, influence the rules under which these developments are taking place. And we shouldn't underestimate, especially in digitalization, the European role, because it's hard because your experience in social policy, it's hard, you know, to influence the national rules for social policy because we have completely different pension systems in all the 27, 28 member states, so it's hard to harmonize it, like the tax systems. But in the basics for the digital future, we are still in the beginning, and so therefore Europe may have a say in this if we are acting in a common way.
Professor Heikki Paloheimo. It should be on.
My question comes from the same point of view as Mr. Tuomioja's. Federal President Steinmeier had a very positive and optimistic ideas of the possibilities of joint European policies and active role of European Union. Now, the ideological basis of a good functioning policy in the European Union is based on a liberal state, the values of the liberal democracy, pluralistic state. But now the trend in the 21st century in a way undermines this idea of state that has been dominant in Western Europe after the Second World War. We are in a way coming back to an idea of state is a nation state. State is for a nation. This is a very different idea of states compared to the liberal democracy and pluralist democracy idea of states. And this gives problems to the European Union because I suppose that the stronger this idea of state as a nation state, as a new zeitgeist in Europe, it undermines possibilities of functioning joint polities in the European Union. So it's a broad question. How do you cope with this kind of rising zeitgeist of nation state?
You know, it's better to live without this kind of zeitgeist, without any doubt. But, you know, the main question is, from my point of view, are we really without any defense in this conflict? And my perhaps not optimistic but self-confident view is We have not yet lost the battle, and I see the advantages on our side. We should be realistic. There is a systemic rivalry. There are more people in our European member states, those who are asking, you know, in the past we were believing that economic success and liberal democracies are twins, and that only in liberal democracies economy can blossom. And now they are asking what is happening in China. There is no liberal democracy, but economic success. I'm sure nobody of those who is asking the question will live under circumstances of China. And therefore I'm saying we are not at the end of the conflict. We are in the middle. And we have to be self-confident about, that is what the last sentence in my speech, we have to be self-confident that what we are living here, the liberal democracy, is still a role model for which we should fight for. And when you need another example, you know, look to the conflict in Romania, for instance. A really harsh conflict in which the president, who is fighting for the rules of a liberal democracies, was really under pressure of those who are, you know, fighting for something else. Don't know what, but something else. And the outcome of the European elections is not exactly the answer to that conflict, but it was easy to see that the European elections were not only a voting, in Romania, not only a voting about the parliamentarians for the European Parliament, but was a strengthening of the position of the liberal democracy in Romania. So therefore, I'm not convinced. It's the contrary, that even if we are now in a systemic rivalry with those who want a more autocratic system, I'm very self-confident that this is not the will of the majority of the European member state. The fight might be harder, but the advantage is on our side, on the side of the Liberal Democrats.
Minister for Foreign Affairs, Pekka Haavisto. And let me just tell you that we have 12 minutes and 11 names on the list.
Sorry, I try to be brief. Thank you, President. It's a very interesting debate. And I want to follow actually what you, President Steinmeier, mentioned about the shrinking space that we feel is there for European Union foreign policy. But at the same time, in Africa, in Sudan, for example, we are complaining China is there, Arab countries are there, but where are we? We are not there actually with our so strong common positions. But I want to widen this to an area that is closer to us, to the Western Balkans. We are speaking so much about the Brexit and country leaving European Union, but we have in a queue countries that would love to join European Union, and many young people in these countries actually share the European values. What can we do better in our closest areas in the Western Balkans? Of course, we are following the criteria, economy, legislation, and so forth, but can we somehow promote the European values better there? Thank you.
The best what we can do is not to disappoint those who are showing efforts in the right directions, speaking about Northern Macedonia, and are doing what we were expecting from them. And, you know, the expectation of the European Union was very clear. Change your course, be ready for an agreement with Greece, and then that was a promise, the European Union will be ready for opening the accession negotiations. Now, we are in a delicate phase, because they have done their work, and so far, Europe is not yet following. And, you know, this is the main answer to your question, because keeping credibility is one of the basic conditions that we are able to keep our European behavior as a role model for our neighbor regions. If we are canceling what we have promised, I'm afraid, the Western Balkans will no longer look for the European values and keep that as their objective for their national development. Then I'm afraid we are losing them for a European approach, and there will be others present in the region, if not already now. There will be others present in the region which are very grateful that Europe is losing its interest.
Yes, like you, I visited Slovenia, and I guess we got the same information. The problem, number one, is that the European Union is not speaking in one voice. So we heard, at least to me and I guess to you too, that there are several different kind of promises, and that's confusing, naturally. But basically, I go a bit further. We all remember when we were joining the Union, Sweden, Austria, Finland, we were put in the waiting room, European economic space. And somehow, even that is not used in later enlargements, somehow we should have a mechanism where you can, in a way, guarantee a status, a European status for different nations which would like to join, and then during the time passes, see how they develop. But give a signal, you're Europeans. The problems seem to be, quite open in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and we actually do not know what is happening there, or who there is, like you said, already now.
Yeah, it's completely different. Bosnia-Herzegovina is not very encouraging since years. Northern Macedonia has walked a long distance with internal conflicts, but now in a new period of their national politics and with a different behavior towards Europe. So therefore, we cannot deal with all the Western Balkan states equally, but we should show that we are aware about the differences.
But the problem might appear that they would like to be dealt as a group. Yeah. That is the new strategy against, according to Slovenian president.
Yeah. Yeah.
The president has also invited students of international relations. One of them is Toni Salminen, please.
Not one of the youngsters, students.
Hi. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly.
My name is Jussi Laatikainen.
Yes.
But you're right, I'm here as a part of a group. We are a group of 6 students from different fields of science, and this is, I think it deserves to be mentioned that this is the first time ever that in this crowd there are students among us, and we would like to thank you for that, Mr. President. But to my question is, you mentioned digitalization, and I would be really interested hearing your views about digital protectionism. I hate those words, but I'm talking about projects as GPS versus Galileo, and I believe Britain has its own project, and Galileo is an exception on that group since it's still an international project. So I think it's really interesting that the EU, in that matter, stays united compared to other countries? Thank you.
You know, when I was commenting that, I was not talking about European protectionism, or that in this phase of the development of the new digital world, Europe should take initiative for competing projects. I think, you know, competing after 15, 20 years of development with Google, with Microsoft, with Facebook, has become difficult, if not impossible. But, you know, I was talking about the rules for privacy, about the rules for transparency, about the main and basic economic terms. And here we are still in the beginning. And I'm avoid, Erki, the word optimistic, but to see with a realistic view what is happening now in the US, especially around the Silicon Valley in California, you know, there is, in the meanwhile, there is a certain understanding that freedom needs rules, and that new freedoms, meaning digitalization, needs new rules. That is a completely different situation of discussion compared with 10 years ago. We know where nobody in the US, and especially in California, was ready to discuss about rules. Now, in the meanwhile, you know, I think the risks, especially, you know, with regard to privacy, are well known also there. And there is a readiness for an international discussion. And so we should play, as Europeans, we should play our role, and perhaps not focus on producing our own competing projects with a lot of European money, because when I regard the numbers, the volume of investments, and see that you know, the whole European Union is now investing €5 billion in artificial intelligence, and only the big five in the US are investing in the same time, in the same period, $30 billion. There is an inequality in shaping the future. So therefore, I think the really self-confident and strong role of Europe could be when we are talking about the rules under which digitalization will happen in the next 20 and 30 years.
Time for the last question. I'm very sorry for the people who will not have the chance to ask questions today. We do have tomorrow. Li Andersson, Minister of Education, please.
Thank you. There's been so much talk about pessimism and optimism. So I felt that I had to comment and say that I think personally one of the best quotes from this very interesting conversation was when you said that optimism is our duty as presidents. Because I think it's understandable that many citizens in Europe feel pessimism when they read about the current state of affairs globally, or when they read about climate change, when you see the negative consequences of globalization in your own hometown, for example. But the most important task of European leaders is to be optimistic, and also to restore the trust of people in the capacity of politics and politicians and leaders and the European Union to solve global issues such as climate change, to affect the rules of globalization, or affect the rules and change the rules of digitalizations, to be more equal, to better take into consideration the status of normal people and their living conditions. And also, I think, to defend, for people to trust that politics will stand up for human rights and democracy at a time when it's being challenged from many areas. Yeah. So I guess my questions would be that, do you think that we haven't done enough in this regard, or do you think that it's that we haven't been able to communicate a message of optimism well enough to the citizens of Europe?
Yeah. Good question. I remember a sentence of my former colleague from India, which was saying, the difference to the writing is that in politics, you never have a point at the end of the sentence with every comma. So, so I think it's realistic enough to know that all the steps we are going, all the issues we were discussing about digitalization, social equality, the future of pensions, the future of health policy, because we were talking about health policy, in societies like ours, with a huge demographic dynamic, you will never find a final solution. And we have to explain as politicians that an intelligent political approach will lead to a next period, but will never be able to present a final solution. So sometimes it's perhaps helpful to lower the expectations a little bit than to lose ourselves in promises which nobody is able to fulfill. And what you were saying about optimism, I think it's our duty as politicians, not only as presidents, to show in a self-confident manner that we are able to deal with the future. If we are losing any kind of self-confidence and, focusing ourselves and complaining about the present situation, we should not be surprised that the people are not following. So I'm not calling for an irrealistic or an unrealistic way of doing politics, but I'm convinced, if not politics, if not liberal democracies deliver solutions, who else? Autocratic systems are dealing with their stability, but not with the future. And so therefore, I'm really fighting as far as I'm possible for the liberal democracy and the conviction that liberal democracies are able to solve the problems which are not easy in a complex world around us, that liberal democracies are able to deal with the future.
Well, I believe that we have all the reasons to be optimistic. Why? Because of what has happened so far. Actually, we are living now in Finland, in Europe, even globally, better times than never before. I do admit that this kind of discussion we have had here emphasizes problems we are facing in the future. But you have to maybe ask also that if we wouldn't take them seriously, which might sound a bit pessimistic, but nevertheless, it's more taking them seriously, and that's why they are controlling and, dominating the discussion. But if we don't do that, well, we can't say in 10 years' time that we are better off than never before, because the idea with this discussion, for example, is to tackle those problems. But maybe we should remember every now and then say that, well, let's be optimistic because we have all the reasons to be optimistic that the developments continue like they have done so far.
Mr. President, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
You are allowed. And please join the presidential couples next door at the reception. And Journalists, we will see you tomorrow morning. Thank you.